Here is a place that has been here for millennia. And we were within 10 to 20 feet of elevation loss in the lake, of losing it all.
I think a lot of people are drawn to Mono Lake because it is so dramatic here. It is so different here than other lakes, other lake basins. You have the Sierra Nevada rising up over 6,000 feet from the lake's surface, just within a few miles. The canyons bringing water into the lake, and then volcanoes to the north, and older volcanic hills to the east, and one of the youngest volcanic mountain ranges in North America, if not the youngest, just to the south, the Mono Craters. So with all this dramatic geology, all the volcanic activity that's occurred in the recent past, and because of the changing lake levels, the past glaciations, you have a really dramatic and austere landscape here that's over 1 million years in the making.
One of the things that draws people to Mono Lake is tufa. Tufa is composed of calcium carbonate, which is a rock. It's limestone, essentially, and it forms where calcium in fresh water that bubbles up from the ground enters the lake. And where those two fluids mix, the calcium from the fresh water and the carbonate, which is so abundant in the lake, precipitate out as calcium carbonate. Each one of these represents a fossil spring, in a sense, and we group tufas into tufa towers, and if there are many of them, we call them tufa groves. They tend very often to form along lines, and you can see a linear grouping of towers right out here. These are faults. And of course, it's going to be along faults that the fresh water would find its way to the surface and into the lake.
So Mono Lake has this extreme water. It's very salty. It's about 2.5 times as salty as the ocean. And it's also very alkaline, which is toxic to most aquatic life on Earth. Yet, here at Mono Lake, you have this incredibly productive ecosystem within these waters. Mono Lake brine shrimp are basically a fairy shrimp, which is a kind of a primitive crustacean. And they're here in huge numbers, trillions of them, and depending on the year, there could be anywhere from 4 to 12 trillion shrimp in Mono Lake, as best as we can estimate. And they're all grazing on algae. The alkali flies are an important part of the Mono Lake ecosystem as well. They spend a good part of their life underwater. They start out as an egg, which hatches into a larva. The larva eats algae, grows larger, and then pupates, a lot like a caterpillar, creates a cocoon. And finally, that fly emerges underwater from the pupa case and floats to the surface of the lake. Mono Lake is critical habitat for 3 main types of birds, California gulls, the eared grebes, and phalaropes. California gulls migrate over the Sierra Nevada, and they breed inland at Mono Lake and the Great Salt Lake. Mono Lake is a place where they can come and nest on the islands safely, away from predators, and have plenty of food in the form of shrimp and flies. water makes up everything that is life on Earth. It makes up a large portion of our bodies and a large part of all the living systems on Earth. And Mono Lake's entire ecosystem is dependent on water. Mono Lake has seen thousands of years of geologic change, and then within one generation, we managed to threaten the lake's existence due to water diversions.
So the aqueduct was built to go and get water for the city of Los Angeles. It needed it to grow. That was the question, how do we get it? They put the money together, they built the aqueduct system. Where the water came from, what the impacts of those diversions were, simply not part of the equation. When you thought about what might happen at Mono Lake, you really only had to look 100 miles south of us in Owens Valley to the dry Owens Lake bed. And you could go back and see the reports of hundreds of thousands of migratory birds using that lake. They were gone. You knew there were brine shrimp there at one time, they were gone. And so, these are sister lakes, and you could really see the future that Mono Lake was headed toward if something wasn't done.
The raging torrent finally reaches the valley below and joins the Owens River, winding its peaceful way for miles down the Owens Valley, framed by the awe-inspiring range of the Sierra Nevadas. Formerly, these waters were wasted in the saline bed of Owens Lake. Now the enterprise of man has harnessed the river and diverted its course through the world's longest aqueduct.
Early in the 20th century, the leaders of Los Angeles realized the city would not be able to continue to grow without a substantial source of water much larger than what they could find locally. William Mulholland went out in search of that water. He came to the Eastern Sierra and decided this was the place to get it, and that they would construct an aqueduct between the Eastern Sierra and LA to move that water. And through a legendary series of land and water right acquisitions that many people know from movies like Chinatown, they acquired what they needed to do that, and then they built this engineering marvel, a gravity-powered aqueduct with no pumps. There was no electricity that was conveniently available to do that. They built it based on gravity with mule teams and huge manual labor, steam shovels, to move the water out of the Eastern Sierra and deliver it to Los Angeles. Diversion of water from Mono's tributary streams began in 1941. But of course, LA didn't take water directly out of the lake because it's too salty. They took it out of the tributary streams that feed the lake, so they got high quality, clean water. But for the streams, that meant that miles and miles of stream course were dried up as diversions commenced. And so you lost the fishery that had been there, the trout fishery, blue ribbon, well known throughout California. You lost the trees and the streamside forest and all the wildlife that those supported, the migratory birds, nesting birds, the wildlife that was in the bottomlands.
That's when the troubles for this ecosystem started, because they were taking virtually all of the water that flowed into Mono Basin from the streams that came from the Sierra Nevada. And as a result, over a 40-year period, the lake dropped over 40 vertical feet, its volume was cut in half, and its salinity doubled. And so then you started all of the related ecological problems.
Here it comes.
The California National Guard tried to dynamite a moat in the land bridge to Nedget Island to keep coyotes out of the nesting ground.
Whether it's the gull nesting habitat on Nedget Island that got connected, or it was the huge dust storms that were building off of the east shore, or it was just the slow, as the lake shrunk, the changes that were occurring in the ecosystem that would endanger ultimately its life productive capability. All of those forces came together to create what would have been and could have been just a huge ecological catastrophe for this beautiful place.
The lake needed somebody to speak for it. And I think other people find themselves in the same position. They fall in love with a place or a cause or something, and nobody's speaking on its behalf. And just a sense of justice motivated me to organize a Mono Lake committee back in '78.
The very early days, Dave Gaines, my late husband, and I were the primary instigators because we had some time and a little bit of money, and we bought a house in Levining and had headquarters to start with. So we kind of became known as the founders, but there actually were a lot of other people involved. In the early days of the Mono Lake Committee, very few people had been to Mono Lake and knew what was at stake if it were to dry up. So with our encouragement, we had people visiting the lake, going home and writing letters, calling their legislators, trying to save water at home, and also just coming up and visiting the lake. But all of it was based on science.
With a couple of friends from Stanford University, we applied for a grant from NSF, the National Science Foundation, and got a grant to pay for a team of a dozen undergraduates to do a complete ecological study of the Mono Lake Basin. That study produced what we call the 1976 report, and it still stands as the most integrated study of the Mono Lake Basin that's been done.
The Mono Lake Committee, or the Mono Lake situation, was gathering momentum with all the people that came to see the lake and wanted to save it, and there was letters being written and people coming to public hearings. When we went to DWP and suggested a compromise between water to the lake and water to LA, we basically were ignored. About the only thing that changed Los Angeles's view was lawsuits, basically.
The Mono Lake cases are fundamentally about hope. David and Sally Gaines and the others who brought these cases back in 1979 had the chutzpah to sue the most powerful water utility in the state without any specific legal precedent in support. These complaints use the public trust doctrine, the Fish and Game Code, Section 5937, as well as other statutes in a way they had never been used before to limit diversions.
And we achieved it. A unanimous decision from the State Water Resources Control Board, for the first time, changing existing water rights held by the City of Los Angeles. That decision was accepted by all parties. When we held the press conference, the city of Los Angeles, the head of the Department of Water and Power, stood hand in hand with the Mono Lake Committee and the Forest Service and California Trout and National Audubon Society. We were all there together saying, yes, this is the right decision for California.
Mr. Chairman, the board should be very proud of what it's done. Today, my friends, we've done the right thing. Today, we saved Mono Lake. Thank you.
What changed? What changed was we understood that we had more capacity to have a reliable water supply and a vibrant ecosystem. The Mono Lake Committee, California and California Trout, did not seek to end all diversions. Instead, we sought a reasonable compromise. The decision that the State Water Board made in 1994 on a long-term basis will permit Los Angeles to divert roughly 1/4 of the freshwater flow of these creeks. So Los Angeles will receive that benefit, and the creeks in the lake will receive the balance. The other remedy was funding that the Mono Lake Committee and others helped secure for Los Angeles to construct a wastewater reclamation facility. In effect, Los Angeles received sufficient funding to build a facility to make up for all of the lost flow from the Mono Basin.
Really what that decision gave to us was an opportunity to understand that we in the city of Los Angeles can have a very reliable future supply of water, while at the same time ensuring that the Mono Basin remains intact, thriving, and as an ecosystem model that others could look at as a success story for being able to ensure economic development and prosperity in Southern California, while at the same time ensuring that the Mono Lake Basin's ecosystem remain not only intact, but thriving and restored.
It was an important victory for Mono Lake in terms of the water rights, but it was a piece of paper that made a promise to the lake and to the future. But its fulfillment is dependent on all of us.
So we're sometimes asked, the committee won its water rights fight with Los Angeles. You know, what are you doing today? And the answer is, the committee wasn't founded to fight Los Angeles. The committee was founded out of a love for this special place, the lake, the streams, the basin. And the water rights struggle was the most urgent thing to do to protect the area. But it's not by any means the only thing necessary to protect Mono Lake, to restore Mono Lake, to assure that it's here for future generations. And that's the work the committee does year after year into the future. The committee works in really 4 different areas. We work on protection efforts for Mono Lake and the streams and the surrounding lands. It deals with water rights or land use issues. We work on restoration of the lake and the streams to recover from all the past damage that was done here. We work on education programs, both to share the lake with people who might be visiting for an hour, or share this place with kids who come up with a school group for a week at a time. And then the last area we're working is science and making sure that we still have a tradition of scientific inquiry going, because good management, assuring the health of this area for the future, depends on having scientific work being done. I think the legacy of Mono Lake is that it shows that a group of people can get together with a vision of how things could be better and overcome insurmountable odds to make a difference. And the result is that we have Mono Lake today, and that's an inspiration every day.
If a solution had not been found, Mono Lake would have died. But we did find a solution. And as a result of that, Mono Lake is a testimony to our ability to undo some of the damage, heal the land, create that space for what is an enormously important part of our children's future, to be able to protect functioning, healthy ecosystems that aren't important just here in the Eastern Sierra or in California or in the Great Basin, but on a hemispheric basis where you have these wonderful little birds called the phalaropes that come here from Canada, molt, change their feathers. They stay here about 6 weeks, double their weight, and then they fly 3,000 miles to the Altiplano of Peru and Argentina. That is a migration that has been taking place for eons. And by protecting Mono Lake, we're making sure that that's part of our children's and their children's future. Today, when you're walking along Levining Creek, the water is flowing and the trees are growing and the fish are back. And it's such a inspiring place to be, where you know that we as a society have made a choice to undo some of the damage, not all, but it's a place that is healing. Choice, thinking about the connections, figuring out how to solve the problem, and thinking about the future. Those pieces have come together here to make Mono Lake a symbol of what we can do if we put our minds to it.